Welcome to the program. I'm Min San-hee with our panel of foreign journalists. As always, thank you for being here.
Good to be back, thanks.
Frank, what have you been following since we last met?
Well, I've been following, of course, North Korea's recent ICBM test and the reaction of the international community and the United States, of course, and the actions being discussed at the United Nations Security Council.
Elise, it's been a while since we last saw you. What have you been covering?
Well, I've only been back in the country for a few days, but North Korea welcomed me back. So same story, longest range intercontinental ballistic missile, and the reactions to it. Obviously, this is significant, another significant milestone, because many people now believe that if the missile, if it were flattened, could probably reach the east coast of the United States.
Right. Bruce, it's your first time on our show. Tell us a bit about yourself.
Yeah, my name's Bruce Harrison. I'm a foreign correspondent here in Seoul. Contribute to several networks, but mostly these days I'm writing for NBC News Digital. Lately I've been covering North Korea as well. I did a fascinating story recently about unification education in South Korea and the different ways kids learn about the North in schools and outside the classroom as well, and many other stories related to North Korea. And I try and write a few good things about the South as well occasionally.
Right. Well, on Foreign Correspondents this week, we discuss a rather grim reality. Now, it all started with several revelations of sexual misconduct by Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein against many women in the same industry. We have details up next.
Through various social media, the Me2 campaign is spreading quickly. The Me2 campaign was started by American actress Alyssa Milano. On October 15th, through her Twitter account, she called for those who had been sexually harassed or assaulted to speak out with the reply, Me Too. Soon after, pop star Lady Gaga and actresses Evan Rachel Wood and Reese Witherspoon took part in the campaign.
I am a sexual assault survivor, and I know the effects, the aftermath, the trauma, psychological, physical, mental.
This campaign began after Hollywood film producer Harvey Weinstein was implicated in a slew of sexual harassments. Harvey Weinstein produced some of the biggest films in Hollywood, including The King's Speech, the Lord of the Rings series, and more. On October 5th, the New York Times revealed that Harvey Weinstein had been molesting not just female employees of his company, but also film actresses for the past 30 years. After the report, a number of Hollywood actresses came out and testified.
I have been silenced for 20 years. I have been slut-shamed. I have been harassed. I'm just like you.
Since Weinstein's sexual harassment accusations, more perpetrators have been revealed. Film director James Toback and actors such as Dustin Hoffman, Kevin Spacey, Charlie Sheen and others have been identified as perpetrators. The Me Too campaign was started by famous stars in Hollywood. Its shockwaves are spreading across the globe.
Right. Frank, what are your thoughts about the rallying cry against harassment across the globe by many?
I think it's probably overdue. Looking at the scope of the outcry that's taken place on social media, I think really demonstrates to the depth of this problem. And we shouldn't just confine it to where that outcry is being made the loudest in the United States. We should look at societies around the world.
Elise, what are your thoughts on the Me Too campaign?
Well, I find it really empowering and wonderful that a lot of women are speaking up. This is a hopeful moment, especially because men in power are being held accountable. But of course, we can't talk about this without mentioning, one man who hasn't been held accountable, who is the President of the United States, who has, admitted to sexual assault numerous times. And so while this is a hopeful moment, it's kind of one of cautious optimism, I think, because there have been waves in the past, like in the 1970s when the term sexual harassment was first created so that there was a language around what was happening to women in the workplace. But it is hopeful, I think, that a lot of brave women are coming forward.
Bruce, what are your thoughts?
I've taken this opportunity to reflect on my own life a little bit, honestly. I was surprised at how many people I knew, and particularly in the United States that I used to work with in media, popped up on my Facebook account saying Me Too, or on Twitter. And I was there working with them the entire time. And I don't know specifically who they're referencing in the workplace, but they're pointing fingers, not directly, but they're saying this happened to me. And I'm wondering, where was I? Why was I so blind to this? Is it because I'm a man? Is it because of the patriarchal world we live in? We're just so used to these abuses. So I'm asking a lot of questions about that particularly, and I would have to agree with Elise as well that it's a big moment, a watershed of allegations coming out and people falling from their high positions, but maybe one that should be taken with cautious optimism as well.
Right. Now, before we delve any deeper into the hashtag that highlights harassment, Elise, do tell us a bit about the scandal involving Harvey Weinstein.
Well, Weinstein himself was arguably a titan of Hollywood, somebody who could greenlight projects, who funded them, who hired and fired producers, actors, writers in the industry, and so he abused his position of power, as it turns out, for decades in order to feed his own sexual predilections. Eventually, the New York Times, which had been trying to report on him many years ago, but he, as it turns out also, had private investigators and a band of lawyers who were trying to shut down any investigations of his misconduct. So he was really overseeing a system in which power protected power for years. And that meant that all the while there were dozens upon dozens of women that were victimized by him specifically, but then by the system in which many people were complicit.
And speaking of the victims of such appalling abuse, many of them kept their shocking assaults a secret for quite some time. Why do you think that was the case?
There is no benefit for women to speak forward or to come forward when women are often shamed, punished, they're gaslit. It's a term that's really in the vernacular a lot, which means essentially women are made to question their own realities. People will say, oh, well, maybe you were misreading that. Oh, he was just being friendly. I mean, this happens all of the time. And so not only are you likely to be punished for coming forward, you're also not likely to see justice when you come forward. So in a lot of workplaces, if you are made to feel unsafe, there is something called human resources where you're supposed to go and make a complaint. But human resources, as has been exposed in a lot of this movement that we're seeing now, is often a black hole where these investigations never see the light of day. But more importantly for women or victims in general, there is no justice. These people aren't being held accountable. So you have a lot of reasons why it's a complicated equation, but mostly this is an economic cost-benefit analysis. The cost always outweighs the benefits for a woman coming forward.
So do you think women who expose these assaults are potentially exposing themselves to further discrimination?
Of course they are.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the big challenges in addressing this issue is in adjusting our attitude toward those victims. And especially what we've seen with the Me2 campaign is that a lot of credit is being given to the women that are coming out, the courageous women that are, risking their careers to a degree, and I think that it's laudable that they are coming out, and our attitudes need to be adjusted toward those women that are coming out with these allegations.
What's also promising is that the year 2017 appears to have unleashed a horror of harassment stories like worldwide, including here in Korea. Why 2017, do you suppose, Bruce? Why now?
I think the game has changed to a certain degree. Maybe this has been building for some time. I'll say it again, we should view the entire situation with cautious optimism. Is this just a brief period? where women will feel liberated enough to speak up about being victims of sexual assault and beyond in the workplace. But it's perhaps been building a bit, and maybe social media and new technology has contributed as well. When you feel you're not alone, perhaps, you feel no longer insulated, you can speak out, I suppose.
I was interviewing New Hampshire Representative Annie Kuster, who is the congressional sponsor of the Me2 Act in the US Congress that would shore up a lot of sexual harassment reporting procedures inside Congress itself for Hill aides. And she was actually assaulted 40 years ago and never spoke about it when she was a congressional aide. But she talked about how she believed that this movement not only came about as a result of social media and the fact that, you know, this platform has allowed many women to feel safe in coming forward, but also because there was a sense of justice being done. So men in power were being held accountable, and that actually means a lot more than all these sexual harassment training videos that were made to watch in workplaces. And then also that this could possibly be a latent reaction to the 2016 election when Donald Trump was exposed on an Access Hollywood tape having bragged about grabbing women by their genitalia. You know, he was then subsequently elected, but she thinks that the fact that this is kind of the reality that there is a sexual predator in the White House has also led to, you know, women feeling emboldened and empowered in this moment. So there could be a number of factors, but that's what one representative in the US would say.
Right. Now, current allegations made by famous people around the world, famous women around the world, do you suppose this will encourage more ordinary victims to also speak out, do you suppose?
I think it already is trickling down. The people that I've worked with, I'm seeing on social media coming out and saying Me Too. They're not famous, but people have role models, and I think role models have set a positive example in this situation. And maybe at this point it's more your common folk compared to the rich and famous that have spoken out against their abusers.
Well, following the initial allegations against Harvey Weinstein, men and women across the world have come forward to share their own harrowing stories of harassment by those in power. We have details up next.
It is at the heart of the film industry, Hollywood, where the Me2 campaign started. That movement is also spreading throughout American politics. On November 9th, the Washington Post reported that Roy Moore had sexually harassed teenage girls while running for the U.S. Senate as a Republican in Alabama. Despite the Republican Party demanding him to drop out of the race, Moore denied the allegations and stated that he will still run in the election. Al Franken, a former comedian who is now a U.S. Senator, was accused of kissing and groping a woman while on tour to entertain U.S. troops stationed abroad back in 2006. Recently, former U.S. President George H.W. Bush was also identified as a perpetrator, as he was known to have groped women while taking pictures with them. The Me2 campaign has gone beyond borders into the realms of the economy, media and sports. In the process, the inappropriate actions of these sexual perpetrators are being revealed to the world. Meanwhile, Korea experienced a similar phenomenon to the Me2 campaign last year. In the fall of 2016, people were left in shock after a number of famous novelists, poets and curators of art museums were identified as sexual offenders. To raise awareness of the problems, a social media campaign was launched, encouraging users to post #sexual violence in the literary world and #sexual violence in the arts and culture. And in 2017, sexual assault in the workplace became a hot issue. While sexual violence in the workplace has always occurred, many victims chose to stay silent. Because of this, there are calls for a movement similar to the Me2 campaign here in Korea to raise awareness of the issue of sexual assault. Sexual assault can happen to anyone and anywhere. Reflecting this reality, the Me2 campaign has become a hot topic for many people in different fields throughout the world.
Right then, before we go any further, how would you, Frank, define sexual assault?
I would say it's inappropriate sexual advances you know, you could say of any nature, the comments and come-ons that men might make inappropriately to women that do not want that type of attention. It doesn't, I don't think it needs to be physical in nature to be considered sexual harassment, certainly. And I think that men need to address their own behaviors and read more carefully whether those advances are wanted or unwanted, particularly in the workplace.
Right. Now, times have also changed, and what previously may have been discarded as a harmless joke is no longer considered as such. For example, words like hello, sexy, etc. In the past, maybe some just laughed it off. Right now, at this time in society, we don't. Can you give us a similar, for example, scenario?
Maybe catcalling, perhaps. I think that's a bit stronger. I think that's probably typically always unwanted. I think you have to make sure you know who you're working with, or you know who you're speaking to. If it's a close, dear friend, and you've reached a comfort level where you can make jokes, perhaps, of a sexual nature, I don't think we should reach a point in society where that is eliminated, you know. But then again, you need to know the comfort level of the person you're working with. Never approach somebody like that initially. I mean, if it's a close friend, I don't want to be able to not, you know, have a joking relationship with that person, perhaps.
Also, questionable sexual harassment always has to do with power dynamics, that is, subordinates. So a woman who is not outright saying no might be saying an implicit no, but cannot say no because they are talking to their boss. So this happened at NPR. You know, our vice president of news, the highest person in our newsroom, was let go on Halloween, specifically because of sexual misconduct and harassment. And the problem there was he was often asking women out to drinks after work. These women worked for him, so they could not say no, or felt as though they could not say no. And there was a pattern of this sort of abuse. So when we're talking about sexual harassment, they cannot be divorced from power dynamics.
Right. Do you believe, Frank, that the attitude to sexual offenses differs depending on the culture? For example, do you think perhaps is Korea, I'm not sure if this is the right word, but more lenient perhaps to sexual offenses if the assailant claims to have been under the influence of alcohol?
I think that's an example of, you know, the drunk excuse. And I would say that there are different definitions of sexual harassment around the world. As I mentioned earlier, I think, you know, we need to recognize that this isn't just a problem that's confined to the United States, but it's being boomed out in the media in the United States. And I think the U.S., in a sense, needs to be lauded for that. This is a problem that certainly exists elsewhere in the world, including in South Korea. And this, you know, idea of the drunk excuse here in South Korea, you know, somehow influencing the perspective that people have on sexual harassment here tells to that difference, the cultural difference that exists around the world. And I think South Korea could perhaps learn from what's going on in the U.S. on this issue.
Is the excuse accepted in the U.S.?
The drunk excuse? I was drunk, so I, A, should not be held accountable. Maybe less so, but I don't think it's ever really a valid excuse. It's a pretty thorny issue.
And people are still trying to use that excuse. Richard Branson is using that excuse for some of his behavior. So, you know, I think that that's not, again, the drunk excuse isn't just confined to South Korea either. Kevin Spacey also used the drunk excuse as well in responding to the allegations made against him. And I don't think that's a good excuse.
Quite recently, a mother in the UK made headlines for calling on her 6-year-old son's class teacher to remove Sleeping Beauty from the class reading list. Now, her argument was that the book taught about inappropriate behavior. She claimed that the idea of kissing a sleeping princess without her consent was sending mixed signals to her son. How do you respond, Frank?
Well, I think the mixed signals with that might be the, you know, sexist nature of that story in general, and not the particular activity of kissing the Sleeping Beauty. And we see this a lot in the fairy tales of the past, how sexist that many of them are. And I think that's a better example of that than inappropriate inappropriate sexual touching, although, you know, that is an interesting perspective, certainly.
What are your thoughts, Elise?
Same thing. I mean, those princess stories from the 1930s are outdated and need to not be in our classrooms. Sure. I mean, Snow White is a terrible story. I mean, she is rescued by a prince who kisses her, you know, and they fell in love instantly. I mean, all these ideas of women being objectified and then needing a prince to rescue them, they're terrible. I mean, I don't want them for my own daughters. And thankfully, culture has changed, and those are not the movies that Disney is putting out right now. They're putting out stories about Moana, who is a wayfinder on the sea, and Inside Out, which explores the inner workings of our brains and psychology. Like, that is that represents progress. And we don't need to be showing things like Snow White and Sleeping Beauty when there are so many more choices.
And let's turn our attention now to politicians who have also been accused. We mentioned them earlier. Do you see their political careers being affected in the long run, Bruce?
Unfortunately, many of them no. As Elise mentioned, the man in the White House, President Donald Trump, seems to be immune to very solid allegations of sexual assault. We have Roy Moore running for the U.S. Senate, correct, in the state of Alabama. And he almost seems insulated from these criticisms. For some reason, his campaign is still on track. And I see maybe an alarming trend, perhaps, and I could be wrong, but everyone who's accused of sexual assault needs to be investigated, and we need to get to the bottom of the accusations, and these people need to step down, perhaps, if that's what it comes to.
Right. Now, it was the New York Times that revealed the first allegations against Harvey Weinstein. What, perhaps, can the media do to make these allegations better known, to perhaps protect potential victims? What role could we play?
I think you know, the media is doing a pretty good job. If you look at the New York Times, they even fired or disciplined one of their own reporters, a top-level reporter, and they're investigating other people within the media. I like the idea of the fingers being pointed at themselves as well. So, you know, there's a cleaning house that's going on, and I think the media can really play a very productive role in this, and it has so far. It needs to continue to do that.
What about the judicial system, the legislations? Could we make tougher laws to condemn those who commit such crimes, Elise?
Sure, but a lot of this is happening in the workplace, where these are workplaces and businesses that should be holding their own employees accountable, and that ends up being outside of necessarily criminal jurisdiction, because a lot of this behavior is just pernicious, it's quite bad, and it should not be okay with the standards of an organization. And so it doesn't necessarily require, there's already plenty of laws and statutes on the books about inappropriate sexual behavior or assault, as we discussed. But in this case, this is about harassment in the workplace. And so I think one of the most powerful things that can happen is that bosses take action and they remove harassers, they remove sexual predators from their ranks, and that sends a message to men to not behave that way, and also to the victims to say, okay, well, maybe there is justice.
One of the things that we need to recognize is that the leaders in the workplace need to identify this behavior and act on it. The failure to act on it is a kind of enabling of that behavior. And this is one of the things that had been criticized of the Charlie Rose incident, where people were saying to potential accusers, oh, that's just Charlie being Charlie. That's completely enabling that type of behavior. And it'll be very interesting to see if the courts prosecute those companies and organizations and individuals that have enabled that kind of behavior to go on.
But we shouldn't count on the courts to correct a problem that the culture should correct. Like, this is a cultural problem, and relying on like strict law to correct it, I think, is a really narrow-minded approach.
Yeah, fair. Just adding on what both they said, I'm curious to see where it ends. I mean, the men that have been toppled most recently have millions, maybe perhaps billions of dollars. Matt Lauer made $25 million a year, the host of NBC. We're just learning about allegations against him. Elise is right, the culture should change, but at the same time, now that they've been ousted from their companies, where does the justice system pick up? And how rich do you have to be to have the best lawyer to perhaps avoid any prosecution beyond losing your job? I'd like to see where that ends as well.
And time will tell. Right, well, findings by the UN Women show 35% of women worldwide have experienced a physical or sexual violence. Now, in response to this reality, CNN claimed in 2017 the world has made one thing clear: sexual harassment is everywhere. Well, keeping this in mind, let's work on making the everywhere into nowhere. Thank you for watching.